Somewhere in Ice Age Germany, a puppy got seriously sick. Not a little sick, the kind of sick that kills a wild animal in days, not weeks. And yet this one lived for weeks, sick the entire time, cared for by people who gained absolutely nothing useful from keeping it alive, at a moment in history when every extra mouth to feed was a genuine risk to the whole group. Stay with me closely for the next 20 minutes, and you'll get the actual diagnosis researchers pulled from this puppy's teeth 14,000 years later, the exact reason veterinary scientists say it couldn't have survived without deliberate human care, and proof that this wasn't a one-off. The same pattern shows up at other sites, on other continents, centuries apart. This is the oldest solid evidence we have of humans loving a dog for no practical reason at all. Sprout wasn't there, but the evidence was. Fully researched, fully sourced. Every source is linked in the description below. Ask most people why humans first kept dogs around and you'll get some version of the same answer. Guarding, hunting, hauling. A working relationship, something transactional. You protect my camp, I feed you scraps. That story isn't wrong exactly, and it's the version that's dominated the science for a long time. The leading practical model goes something like this. Wolves that scavenged near human camps and showed less fear benefited from easy access to food waste. Humans tolerated the friendliest and most useful of them, and across many generations, natural selection quietly reshaped a predator into a partner. According to that idea, whatever affection developed was a side effect. A happy accident riding along on top of a practical arrangement. But there's a case that complicates it badly, and it's sitting in a museum drawer in Germany, mislabeled for over 60 years before anyone realized what they actually had. And what they found in that drawer doesn't just add a detail, it breaks the theory. In 1914, quarry workers near Bonn stumbled onto a grave. Inside were 2 adult humans and some animal bones, a jawbone that got filed away as a wolf and forgotten, while the rest of the skeleton went into an entirely different university collection. For decades, nobody connected the two. It took until the late 1970s for researchers to physically reunite the bones and realize they belonged together, and that the animal wasn't a wolf at all. The Bonn-Oberkassel remains date to roughly 14,000 years ago, making this the oldest confirmed domestic dog burial we have. I found this detail during research and had to read it twice. The case sat there, misfiled and half forgotten, for over 60 years before anyone realized what it actually proved. An entire piece of the story about how humans first bonded with dogs was sitting in the wrong drawer in a university basement, waiting. The skeleton itself tells us the dog stood somewhere between 40 and 50 centimeters tall at the shoulder and weighed roughly 13 to 18 kilograms. A slender build, closer to a modern sighthound or a West Asian wolf than to the stockier breeds most people picture when they hear Ice Age dog. In 2018, a veterinarian and PhD candidate named Luke Johnsons led a full re-examination of the remains, and that's when the story got genuinely strange. The reanalysis revealed a second, previously unnoticed tooth from an entirely different, older dog, meaning this single grave contains evidence of 2 dogs, not 1. Which quietly raises its own question nobody has fully answered yet. Was that second older dog also part of this family's life, or evidence of an even longer relationship with dogs than a single grave can show us? We don't know, but it's a detail worth sitting with. The second dog was older and unrelated to the puppy. It raises the possibility that dog keeping wasn't a one-time experiment by this particular group. It may have been an ongoing, established part of how they lived, generation after generation, long enough that losing 1 dog didn't mean losing the practice entirely. A single grave can only show us 1 confirmed moment. This detail hints at something that may have been happening continuously, quietly, for far longer than the burial itself can prove. But it's the puppy, the younger of the 2 whales, whose story actually rewrites the timeline of human compassion. And what researchers found in its teeth is where this gets hard to explain away. Janssens didn't stop at confirming the species. He examined the puppy's teeth under close analysis, using paleopathology techniques originally developed for modern veterinary dentistry, and found something specific: damage patterns consistent with canine distemper, a severe viral infection contracted at around 19 weeks of age. Let's actually sit with what that disease does, because distemper is a clinical word that hides how brutal it actually is. Canine distemper attacks the respiratory system first: coughing, fever, labored breathing. Then it moves into the gut, causing vomiting and severe diarrhea that would have left a young animal dangerously dehydrated. In its worst stage, it attacks the nervous system directly, causing seizures and a progressive loss of motor control. Even today, with veterinary hospitals, IV fluids, and antiviral treatment available, distemper is still frequently fatal in puppies. To put that in perspective, modern veterinary sources still cite mortality rates for untreated distemper in young, unvaccinated dogs as high as 50% or more, even with basic food security and shelter available. Strip away every modern advantage, no clean water on demand, no reliable calories, freezing temperatures, active predators nearby, and the odds facing this particular puppy would have been dramatically worse than that. Now pay attention, because this is the number that matters most in this entire story. The tooth damage shows this puppy was sick for approximately 6 weeks before it died, at around 27 to 28 weeks old. 6 weeks, not 6 days. 6 weeks of vomiting, fever, and declining coordination in the middle of an ice age winter, with zero chance of surviving on its own. A wild animal this sick doesn't last 6 days out in the open, let alone 6 weeks. It gets left behind or picked off or simply stops moving one cold night and never gets back up. This one didn't. Somebody kept feeding it, kept it warm, kept it alive through symptoms that would have made caring for it genuinely unpleasant, for weeks, with nothing to gain from the effort. Let's actually address the obvious skeptical question here, because a careful viewer should be asking it. How do researchers know this wasn't just a naturally resilient animal that happened to fight off the illness alone? This is where the veterinary science gets genuinely persuasive. Distemper in young, unsupported animals typically follows a fast, brutal path. Dehydration and secondary infection usually prove fatal within days once the gastrointestinal and respiratory symptoms peak, especially in a wild, cold, resource-scarce environment with no source of easy calories or clean water. Janssens and his co-authors specifically concluded that a young dog experiencing this level of illness would not have survived multiple relapses over 6 weeks without consistent human intervention, feeding, warmth, and physical care. That's not a guess dressed up as science. It's a clinical judgment made by someone with actual veterinary training. Let's actually be there for a second, because I don't think the raw facts alone capture what 6 weeks of this really meant. You're huddled in a shelter of hide and bone, ice age wind cutting through every gap in the wall. The puppy hasn't kept food down in 2 days. It's shaking, too weak to stand, and you've already lost track of how many nights you've stayed up listening to make sure it's still breathing. There's no medicine, no vet down the road, just you, softening whatever food you can spare, cleaning up after it, keeping it pressed against your body for warmth because that's the only treatment available. You have no way of knowing if tomorrow is the day it turns a corner or the day it doesn't. Other members of your group have started to ask why you're still bothering. Food is scarce enough already, and this animal hasn't been useful in weeks. Hasn't guarded anything, hasn't hunted anything, has in fact needed to be guarded and fed like one more mouth you can't really spare. There's no argument you could make in the language of survival that justifies the hours you're spending. You don't have one. You keep doing it anyway. You've stopped counting the number of times you've had to clean soiled bedding in the freezing dark. Stopped expecting tomorrow to be the day it gets better. Somewhere along the way, this stopped being about whether the effort made sense. It became about something else entirely. The simple fact that this small, suffering creature was in front of you and you couldn't make yourself walk away from it. You do it anyway, night after night, for 6 weeks straight. And then, it died anyway. What happened next is the part that changed how researchers read this entire case. When the puppy eventually died, the group didn't just leave the body behind, the way they would have with prey they'd hunted or an animal that died naturally near camp. The dog was placed in a formal grave alongside 2 adult humans, and the burial site showed traces of red ochre, a pigment frequently associated with intentional, ceremonial burial practices in this period. This shocked me more than I expected it to, honestly. We've talked on this channel before about how leopards dragged prey into caves, how bodies ended up at the bottom of pits. This is the complete opposite gesture. This wasn't disposal. This was inclusion. Whoever buried this puppy treated its death as something worth marking, the same way they marked the deaths of their own. It's worth pausing on how deliberate this actually was, because burial can sometimes undersell what happened here. This wasn't a body left in a convenient hole. Ochre pigment in this period shows up repeatedly at sites associated with intentional funerary practice. It isn't something that occurs naturally in a grave. which means someone actively chose to apply it as part of a ritual gesture preserved as far as we can tell from the wider archaeological record for members of the group who mattered. Here's the part I actually find more convincing than the Bonn-Oberkassel case on its own, because a single example can always be argued away as unusual. This pattern shows up again, more than once. At a site called Ain Malaha in what's now northern Israel, archaeologists uncovered the burial of an elderly woman dated to roughly 12,000 years ago. She was found lying on her side with her hand resting directly on the body of a 3 to 5 month old puppy, positioned deliberately against her chest. Notice what's repeating here: not a working animal tossed in as an afterthought. A specific, tender, physical gesture chosen deliberately at a burial that happened roughly 2,000 years and an entire continent away from the German case. And it's not just those two sites. At Hayonim Terrace, also in the region, a man was found buried with 2 small dogs roughly 13,000 years ago. Turns out, and this genuinely surprised me, researchers who compared these Natufian dog remains against the wider skeletal record concluded the animals had already undergone real physical change away from wild wolves by this point, showing measurable shifts in size and skull shape compared to their wild ancestors. In their words, domestication was already in a fairly established state at these sites, not something brand new. Which means the Bonn-Oberkassel puppy, roughly 2,000 years earlier, wasn't catching the very beginning of this relationship. It was already partway into a story that had been unfolding for generations before it was ever born. 3 separate sites, 3 separate cultures, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, all reaching the same conclusion independently. Whatever this animal was to us, it belonged in the grave when we died. Slow down with me here, because I think it's worth actually picturing the Ain Malaha burial specifically. This wasn't an animal placed somewhere nearby as an offering. Her hand was resting directly on the puppy's chest, positioned deliberately against her own body. The exact posture a person uses today when they're comforting something small, or being comforted by it. 2 women, 2 puppies, 2 completely different parts of the ancient world, choosing the same gesture without ever knowing the other existed. That's not coincidence, that's something closer to instinct. So if it wasn't purely practical, what was actually driving this? That's where the science gets genuinely divided. This is where researchers genuinely disagree, and I want to be fair to both sides instead of picking the version that makes the better story. The traditional theory is almost entirely practical. Wolves that were slightly less afraid of humans could scavenge safely near camps. Humans tolerated the useful ones that barked at danger or helped track prey, and over many generations, natural selection favored friendlier, more cooperative animals until they became something new entirely. In this theory, affection was a side effect, not the point. But the Bonn-Oberkassel case is genuinely hard to explain through pure practicality. A sick, non-working puppy provides 0 practical value during 6 weeks of vomiting and seizures. Mobile hunter-gatherer groups who had to carry everything they owned on foot would have had every practical reason to abandon a dying animal that was actively costing them time, food, and attention. Researchers involved in the reanalysis specifically argued that the case suggests emotional attachment, not just practical motivation, may have driven at least some early dog-keeping behavior. Follow this next part closely, because it's where the 2 competing theories genuinely collide. If pure practicality were the whole explanation, the rational move here is obvious and cold. Let the sick puppy go, save the resources, maybe try again with a healthier animal later. A group living through the tail end of an ice age didn't have calories or attention to spare on a lost cause. And yet, 6 weeks of continuous care says they made the opposite calculation, over and over, night after night, long after any practical argument for continuing had stopped applying. I also got shocked by how far back the deeper genetic story goes. Separate DNA research estimates that dogs and wolves began genetically diverging from each other somewhere in the range of 15,000 to over 30,000 years ago, well before any of these burial sites, meaning the relationship itself is likely even older than our oldest physical proof of it. Which raises an uncomfortable question for the purely practical theory. If we've been living alongside proto-dogs for that long, why does our very first clear window into the relationship show us 6 weeks of medically pointless devotion, rather than a working animal being put to use? None of this means the practical theory is wrong. guarding and hunting almost certainly played a real role in why dogs stuck around long term, and most researchers think the full picture involves both practical benefit and genuine attachment, reinforcing each other over thousands of years, rather than one replacing the other. But the Bonn-Oberkassel puppy is hard evidence that the emotional side of this story isn't a modern add-on. It was there from the very beginning, we can actually prove. And honestly, that's the version of this story I find far more believable than the coldly practical one, precisely because it matches everything else we've uncovered about how these groups treated their most vulnerable members. And this is where the story stops being about dogs at all. So why does a sick Ice Age puppy matter to you right now? Because it quietly challenges an assumption we don't usually think to question. That love for another species, kept purely because we wanted to, not because it served us, is somehow a modern luxury. Something that shows up when survival gets easier and we have room in our lives for sentiment. The Bonn-Oberkassel case says otherwise. These were people living through the tail end of an ice age with every reason to conserve resources ruthlessly, and they spent 6 weeks caring for an animal that could give nothing back, then buried it like family when it died. Whatever this impulse is, it isn't a byproduct of comfort. It was there before comfort existed. And that's not an isolated case either. 3 separate sites, 3 separate cultures, all reaching for the same gesture without ever meeting each other. Which means the bond between us and dogs isn't something civilization invented, something we picked up once life got easier and comfortable enough to spare affection. We just kept doing what we'd already been doing for thousands of years before anyone wrote a word of it down. There's something worth sitting with in the fact that this bond crosses the species line at all. Every other piece of evidence we've covered on this channel, the surgery, the shared meals, the burial rituals, is a story about how humans treated other humans. This is different. This is proof that whatever capacity we have for sustained, costly, seemingly irrational care doesn't stop at the edge of our own species. It reached out to something that couldn't speak, couldn't explain its pain, and couldn't ever repay the effort in any currency we'd normally recognize. I think that's actually the most surprising part of this whole story, when I really sit with it. We like to imagine empathy as something that requires shared language, shared understanding, some way of the other party communicating "thank you," or "I understand what you're doing for me." This puppy could do none of that. It couldn't explain its symptoms, couldn't ask for help, couldn't offer anything back except its presence. And that turned out to be enough. Notice a pattern yet if you've been with this channel for a while? Every time we dig deep enough into the archaeological record, the same finding keeps surfacing in different costumes. Care, given without guarantee of return, showing up far earlier and far more often than the survival of the fittest version of prehistory ever gave us credit for. We'll be following that thread into stranger territory in an upcoming video, because the puppy and the person aren't the only unlikely pair the fossil record has quietly preserved. Somewhere in an Ice Age winter, a puppy got sick, and instead of walking away, someone stayed. 6 weeks of vomiting, fever, sleepless nights, for an animal that gave nothing back. And when it finally died, they buried it like one of their own. 2,000 years later, and 2,000 miles away, someone else did the exact same thing, without ever knowing the first story existed. Whoever made that decision left behind the oldest solid proof we have that love like that isn't a modern invention. It's just old. Older than farming, older than writing, older than any word we've ever had for it. If this story changed the way you think about our bond with dogs, tell me in the comments. When do you think humans stopped seeing wolves as animals and started seeing them as family? And if you enjoy stories where archaeology quietly rewrites what we thought we knew, subscribe. We've barely scratched the surface. That's the story the bones told us. Stay curious, and I'll see you next time.